So I would like to just introduce myself first. Knit can then introduce herself. I'm AFBates. I have been with the AU for some time now as a writing teacher. Before that, I worked on AppMora. I worked on Alinor. I'm currently one of the writing leads on Valenwood. And I have done a staggeringly small amount of work for IB. I should really do more of that, but I don't. So those are my main projects at the moment. I also work occasionally with elsewhere. I love what I do. One of the things that I love most is the writing a village portion of things. But I'll let Knit introduce herself first before we get started. Go ahead, Knit.
Okay. I have been with the AU for a little while as a teacher, a writing teacher. I mostly worked on writing for Alinor and Valenwood, a lot for Valenwood recently. And I am an editor for Roscrea, where I review other people's NPCs and quests and make sure that they're all formatted consistently and that they fit together in some way. So that's a little bit of what I do, and I love writing villages. I love writing with a partner, and I really would second Bates's comment about finding a partner to write with, or at least to bounce ideas off, because it's very productive and exciting. So
I will give us a little bit of our credentials when it comes to villages. Knit and I became writing partners working on Alinor, where we built the entire village together, every NPC, and that was, wow, jumping in on that was interesting because there was a lot of cultural stuff to learn, but that was our first one, and since then we have worked to do the outline and to do the full village construction for several other villages in Valenwood and to a certain extent in Alinor as well. So we do have experience with the whole do an entire thing, but we've also done a lot of individual work with NPCs and quests as well, and it all feeds in. So let's talk about the order of the day. What are we going to cover? Knit is going to tell you about town planning. Who goes where? What do they do? This is your baseline. And a lot of it as writers, you can't necessarily control. So this isn't stuff you can necessarily do, but it is things you have to know, absolutely have to know if you are going to be building the characters of a village. So when you are going through this, Knit will tell you there are some things you might have the ability to change, even if they are given to you. Like you could maybe change a character's race or gender or something like that. There are things you can't change, like whether there's a mountain there. That's going to stay. So as we're going through this, know that even if it's not under your control, it could very much be important to your process. Second bit will be me. I will talk to you a bit about personality, relations, how this fits together, because it's not just writing one NPC, it's writing the connections between NPCs. And that's not something that's discussed quite as often, but it's what makes the difference between what feels like just a bunch of randos wandering around and what feels like an actual community that you are entering as an outsider, which is a significant difference. Finally, we're going to do a build a village exercise where we build a village with you. So at that time, I would recommend pen and paper or split screening into a Google Doc on one side and this on the other. Just be prepared if you want to join in on that. We're going to see if you can start building your own from what would be given to you by a lead. And you'll be able to see Knit and I's process on that. So why don't you go ahead, Knit?
okay. Well, as Bates said, this is not stuff you always can control. A lot of this is going to be given to you by your writing leads. In fact, most of what I'm going to be talking about will be. So the first thing you have to know is, where is this place on a map? Are we in the woods? What is the biome like? Is it desert? Is it swamp? Is it rainforest? Is the village sitting amid flat farmland? Does it back up to a cliff? Are there rivers? Are there waterfalls? So you need to have a sense of the geographic features of the place because they are usable. You can have characters go out to the waterfall, or maybe there's a mine or in the cliff or something like that. So you have to know the physical geography, and then you also have to know the man-made geography. What is the built environment? Has anything been done to this physical environment? Is there a bridge across the river, or is it further downstream? Were there forts along this coastline, and are they still active, or are there ruins from previous civilizations? If there's ruins, maybe as a writer you can start having ghosts, or maybe Draugr. So you look at the features that are there, and as a writer you think, well, what can I do with those? But you have to know what they are first. How about how people get about? How do they get to and from this village? Are there navigable waterways nearby? Are there roads? Are there tracks through the woods? People in a village need to import and export stuff. So how do they do it? Where do they get their goods to market? What are the trade routes? And then you also want to think about threats. What are the threats to this town? Are there animals, wild animals? Are there hostile forces? Is there a garrison nearby to defend the village? Are there troops nearby? Are there fortified walls? And this comes into play as a writer because you say, well, if the village is vulnerable, how do my NPCs feel about strangers? If they feel vulnerable because it's not very well defended, they might be suspicious of strangers, and that's something worth knowing when you start actually writing the characters. So it's not just about the physical features, it's about how you can use them as a writer. So that's pretty much, where is this place? So then you have to ask yourself, well, what's here and why is it here? Villages don't just crop up out of nowhere like mushrooms. They have a purpose. So why is this town here? And what actually is there? So you want to know, and this is something, again, your lead will give you, how many buildings are there? How many of them are private residences? How are they arranged? Is there like a quadrangle or a circle of houses that then might be an enclave of one family, for example? But also, what is the point of this town? Why is it here? Did it grow up because there's a mining industry around? Is it farmland? So there's a group of farms surrounding the village. Is there a lumber mill? Your NPCs have to work somewhere. And where they're working can be a prosperous place or it can be a declining place. And so if your lead says, well, there's a mine nearby, you can decide whether the mine is, teetering out and the villagers are all depressed about that, or if it's very prosperous. Again, some of the stuff is given to you and some of the stuff you can modify and work with for developing the feel of the village. And, we've got a little sketch here of the map of what the town that we're going to be talking about later. We're calling it Bosmerville. And it is a town that exists on two sides of a river with a bridge in between. So some of the houses are on one side, some are on the other, and we'll talk about how they relate to one another. But your lead may give you a sketch of the village and the placement of the houses that they've already figured out, or not. And you have to make your own little sketch. So this one was not made with a mapping piece of software. I think Bates made this one with just diagrams.net, I think.
Diagrams.net, yeah, this was really easy. It only took me like 45 minutes, and I had never done it before, so if you practice, it'll take you way less than that. So
obviously it's not, to scale, and it's not realistic, but it gives you a sense of where things are in relation to one another. And so it's worth doing that for yourself if your NPC or if your lead has not given you that. So you also want to know what industries are there, what businesses. Now, in Skyrim, there are the big four. There's inns, general stores, blacksmiths, and alchemists. And those are the businesses that the NPC can walk into without being told, you shouldn't be here. They're open at certain times. The inns are open all the time, but the others are open usually 8 to 8. And so you need to know if your town has those. Not all towns have everything. In fact, most towns don't. Here's a breakdown of the towns in Skyrim. I added Winterhold in there because even though it's considered a city, half of it fell into the water. So it's really actually smaller than Riverwood. But you can see how many civilians are there. And I did not include, the Penitus Oculatus because they're not the NPCs that you're going to be writing for a village setting. How many private residences? What is the industry? You can see lumber mills are in some towns, mines are in others. Rorikstead is simply a farming community. It doesn't have either a mill or a mine. And that makes it a little more vulnerable to environmental issues like weather, droughts and things like that. Most of the towns seem to have an inn, but not all of them. Karthweston doesn't have anything. It's just there because there's a mine. You'll see on this diagram also that even if they have one of the big four, they very rarely have more than two of the big four. The only one that has an inn, a blacksmith, and a general store, for example, is Riverwood. And I think that's because that's the first place the player is likely to go after Helgen. So it gives the player an introduction to what's a general store, what's an inn, what's a blacksmith. But typically, you'll be working with a town that has maybe a general store and an inn, or a blacksmith and an inn, not all three. So when you're looking at these businesses, you want to say, well, if there's no inn, where do my NPCs house strangers? I'm going to have a player coming into this town. Where will they stay? How do I deal with that? Is this a place where the player cannot sleep overnight and they have to camp outside? Or is there a camp set up already? So you think about these things in terms of what your gameplay is going to be like. How is this going to work for the player coming into a village where there is an alchemist and a blacksmith, but no inn, for example, like the Skull Village? Where do you stay? So those are considerations that you may or may not have control over, but they're worth thinking about in terms of writing the characters and writing interesting interactions that your NPC can have with that your player can have with these NPCs that you're going to then write. So who are these NPCs? Who are these people? Who lives in this village? Is this all one race? Is it just a whole bunch of Khajiit who went off and had their own little community? Is it mixed? The number and the basic information about the NPCs who populate any village is likely going to be given to you by your leads. But as I think Bates mentioned already, you can ask for changes if there's a reason. If you really feel like someone needs to be older or younger or a different gender or a different race, talk it over with your lead and say, this is why I think it would work better if this person was not a child but an adult, for example. So for some projects, your lead will even provide a spreadsheet showing all the information that has to do with your NPCs. If they don't, make your own spreadsheet. I love spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are my friend. And it really helps you visualize who's in the town and remind yourself. It's a good reference tool to go back to while you're writing. So what are the races? Is this a mixture of Altmer and Bretons? Is it only Bosmer? What are the genders? You want to have a mix of genders and ages, and also intersex. It doesn't all have to be male or female. A good town is going to have a mix of generations as well. You'll probably have some elders, and you'll have some, maybe not children, but maybe younger people. It wouldn't be bad to have a child or two, but you don't have to have all adults. You can mix it up. how are they related to one another? There's families and clans. And if you have a village that's isolated from other things, it becomes very incestuous if you don't have outsiders. So you have tightly knit families, but you also might have a spouse that came from elsewhere, or not necessarily the place called elsewhere, but someplace outside of the village, to bring in new relationships. So you want to have some of the NPCs have come from someplace else. Are there tightly knit clans? Are there kin houses? Some of the regions have very hierarchical structures of kin houses. Does that apply in your town as well? Who has the power in the town? Who has the wealth and status? And that may not be obvious from what your lead has given you, but you can decide those things. And what are their occupations? What do they do? And remember, your player is going to walk into this town and have conversations with the NPCs, and these are things they can ask. Where are you from? You don't look like you're from around here. What's it like living in this town? So having a mixture of things gives you a mixture of things for your NPCs to talk about with the player. Finally, what else do we know about them? Thumbnail descriptions may often be provided by your lead, and they're often very thought-provoking. They give you ideas for character development. They give you ideas for quest development. So let's look at a sample spreadsheet for our Bosmerville village. We've got the names of the characters, and we have their role, their occupation: bridge keeper, innkeeper, sister 1 and sister 2, genders, race, age. It's really nice to have them color-coded because you can immediately see if there's a proper mix of generations and genders. I like to have them by house number rather than named houses. It's just a lot easier because you can look on the map and see where's number 1, where's number 3. And then when you're writing your NPCs, you can have that number be part of the file name, so you know exactly where everybody is, and they're grouped together. But then you have descriptions that are little prompts for you as a writer. And we're going to talk more about these when we actually do our Build a Village. But these are things that you bounce off each other with your partner for ideas of what can you do with this description? Why is this person nervous? And why do they live only in one room of a large house? These are the kinds of questions that your lead might give you little thumbnail sketches, but then you elaborate from there, and you can go anywhere you want with them. So I'm going to turn it over to Bates to talk about personalities and relations, and then we're going to go back to that spreadsheet later and build a village. So your turn, Bates.
Awesome. Thank you, Knit. So individual personalities are something that I have actually covered to a ridiculous amount in another talk that I did for the AU for a different meeting. It's available on the YouTube channel. You will be able to find a characterization talk, also other talks on dialogue, on building quests and everything like that. Really, really great resource, but that's why I'm not going to go extensively into character building. I will say some things, though, that apply specifically to villages. It is really tempting when you create an NPC to create a shining little jewel of uniqueness and special. And that's lovely, but that shining little jewel of uniqueness and special cannot be in a town with 8 other shining little unique special things, because they will have nothing to talk about. They will have nothing in common. You've got to make sure that it's basically Venn diagramming, where things overlap. Sure, we want our NPCs to be unique. We don't want them to be cardboard cutouts or anything. But if no one has anything in common in a village, it becomes very clear. In a city, it's actually easier to hide that because there are more people moving around. But in a village, if you've only got 8 or 9 people, figure they're there for a reason. So they have some economic reason to be together. some familial reason to be together. Find those things that can unite people and get them similar to each other, not just making someone who's got all these cool things. It's not like you're building your own character for an RPG where you just want to be awesome sometimes. If everyone was that way, it would get very immersion breaking very quickly. So look for those moments of similarity. Stereotype avoidance is something I could do an entire talk on just on its own. But what I mean by that in a village setting is things that we have just seen so often before. You know, the starstruck young boy who just wants to go to the big city and leave this town. We've all played that. Eric the Slayer is that. But Eric the Slayer is one of the only characters who is that. So it's okay to use a stereotype from time to time, but you've got to be sure in your village that everyone else who's written a village in your mod that you are working with in the project that you're on hasn't already used that. Because if you go to every village and there is someone who is longing to go to the big city, oh, it's so dull. It can get really overwhelmingly cookie cutter fast if you don't, one, check in with your fellow writers, see what they're doing, read what's been written. Always do that. But two, look into new ways to approach that. So check your stereotypes. There's a really great site, if you don't know it, called TV Tropes. It will give you a ton of tropes and stereotypes. Stereotypes are not always bad, but make sure that you are combining them in interesting ways as opposed to just picking one and running with it. And then the last bit is Pobody's Nerfect, which is the idea that no NPC, no matter how small, is completely free of foibles and weaknesses and flaws. People are people, and people are not perfect. And if you want to build a person that is really interesting, you need to build in the fact that they are fallible and not perfect. So this little wheel on the side can give you a very small sense of some of the things you should be looking for. The traits that you're incorporating, their own sense of identity. Who does this NPC think they are? What do they see in themselves? What do they hold dear? What do they consider a virtue? Is it bravery, or is it perhaps the sense to stay home and not fight that dragon? Is it a special ability that they have that sets them apart? Maybe they're the best smith in Skyrim. Maybe they have something external that sets them apart, and a skill. And then always look at pathologies, things to make them a little bit off the beaten path. There is way more to say on this subject, so check out the characterization one, or I'm sure in the next couple months me or one of the other teachers will also do a talk on NPCs, because it's a subject we can go on and on about. It's such a huge part of what we do. So this is just a little bit more about the interconnections, and this is actually a more corporate and psychological breakdown image, but it applies to our writing as well. Big questions to ask are, what do the NPCs experience socially and culturally in their lives, and how does that affect the town feel for the player? Look at your little circles of interest here, starting with economic stability. And this goes back a little bit to what Knit was saying with the mines. If you've got a mine in a town, and that's their only industry, if the mine starts to fail, they're in serious trouble as a town. However, if you're in a town that has a mine, but also has farms, but also has a mill, or whatever, you've got a much more economically stable place. For instance, Riverwood is technically a mill town. They've got a mill there, a lumber mill, but they do other things. There's the Riverwood Trader, so there is a serious trade aspect to the town itself. They've got an inn, so they have some income that way. And so looking at the economic stability of the place determines how on guard some of your NPCs are going to be. If they are feeling like maybe the mine has started to fail, but they really, really hope it hasn't and nobody's talking about it, because if you say it out loud, it feels way more real, then you've got an element of tension in your town that you can work with as a writer. Or if someone just struck gold, but they don't want the rest of the town to know it, that's a great quest. So you can use that stability either in a depressive state of things are going badly, or in a more positive, things are suddenly going very well way, to start drafting out quest proposals for your place and to influence your dialogue for your NPCs. Education. In Tamriel as a whole, we don't really have schools that much in most regions. It's not really a thing. But what we do have are things like the College of Winterhold and specific training places. So that can determine the health of your town when it comes to, is there someone who is trained as a mage, maybe to protect the town? Is there no magic at all? Is there one person who has magic and is going to have to leave to get education because there's no one to train them? Like, you can do a lot with the idea of knowing things and not knowing things, being educated in a skill, trade, magic, whatever, or not. So that's that element that applies to us. I'm just going to skip over to health and healthcare because it's very similar. Does your town have a healer? Does your town have an alchemist? If the answer is no to both of those things, what do they do if someone gets hurt? Do they have to go to the nearby city? Do people have to be transported there if there's an accident at the mill or something? Or is this a situation where people really are living on the edge and don't have a way to recover from injury or illness? This is another source of possible tension. This is another source of possible interesting NPCs that you could do. Keep in mind that small places in out of the way locations often have issues with the healthcare. Neighborhood built environment. Some towns are old, some towns are new. And what that means is that you could have a place that's falling apart because it's been around since the Second Era. You could have a place that's so new that the boards aren't even really taken care of yet. They're all just new and untreated because they've just built that settlement. It matters to your NPCs because it determines how attached they are to their location and why. If they're a sort of family that's lived in this place since the ancient times, whatever, then they have a vested interest in staying there and protecting what they have. If it's a much newer place that people come and go, there isn't that sense of ingrained community. But that's not necessarily bad. You can't have every village be ancient, because then you end up with the same feel every time. It's all right to have some newer villages or villages that were rebuilt 100 years ago after they were burned down. There's one that's like that in Valenwood, and it's very interesting because you have the remnants of what used to be there, but it's basically just been overrun by what's new, what's upcoming, and what's modern. So you've lost that sense of ancient, even though up until recently it was there. Fun to work with. And then social community context we will talk about even more in a second, but figure that it basically means, is this a fractured community where people have a lot of issues with each other? Or is this a tight-knit community where people have a lot of issues with you as the player? Those are your two kind of sides of the fence for that. A lot of nuance, but those are your two big ones. Dead people. So when we say dead people, we always think Draugr or ghosts or skeletons. But in this case, dead people can affect the feel of your village. One of the villages I worked on had a child who had died within it. Obviously, the child didn't actually die because you can't kill kids in Skyrim. But the child had been the victim of an attack by outsiders, and the entire village was staggered by this. It wasn't a large place, and so losing her was something that affected all of them, and it meant that as a writer, you could ask various people, how are you dealing with the death of blank? Or how is the father of the girl doing, and they would have different opinions on it. So this girl's presence is in the village, very much so. She's not a character. She's not being designed. She's never going to come back as a ghost as far as I know. And so just because the character technically doesn't exist doesn't mean you can't make them a huge part of your storyline. Gone also works if someone left to go to school at the College of Winterhold or whatever, or to be apprenticed to someone famous or something like that. Their family could miss them, or their family could resent them. Their family could have a lot of opinions on this character that you never ever meet. Gone ones are a little bit more tricky because if you do establish that a character has gone to a real location, it is nice, at least if it is within the mod you are working on, to have that character at the real location, so you're kind of locking yourself in there. So check with your lead if that's going to be a huge part of the feel of your village, that it's possible to put someone in that location. But yeah, incorporating the dead, really fun, it turns out. So, your kind isn't welcome here is something that we hear from time to time in various RPGs especially. But your job as a writer is to make it very clear why. Why isn't the player welcome? Sometimes you'll encounter villages in various games where the player isn't welcome here, but you never find out, did something happen with a stranger before? Did a stranger start a fire or something and now you're worried about all strangers? Or is it due to the player's race? Or is it due to the player not being a member of a certain society or cult or religion? What is it that makes someone want to keep outsiders out? So Wounds and Triumphs refers to the fact that if it's a village that's been around, it's been through stuff. People have probably attacked at some point in most of these provinces, whether they were close by people like bandits or whether it was like an attack of a nation against another nation. They either held their ground or were destroyed and rebuilt. Regardless, that lives in the memory of the people who lived there, regardless of whether or not they were alive at the time. It could have been generations back, but they heard from their grandfather who heard from his grandfather that when the Dark Elves attacked or whatever. So that can come into play. Grudges can also be held, both against people within the village and to the player themselves. An example of that would be the Battleborns and Greymanes. They hold grudges against each other and have prejudice against each respective alignment in the Civil War. They will also show prejudice and hold a grudge against you as a player if you take sides. So that can be both an internal and a player-related prejudice. And then the opinion on outsiders can also be determined by quests. If you have done a quest for someone, then you are welcomed in. The Orc Stronghold near Riften is an example of this. If you do what they ask, then you are let in and you are not treated badly. If you do not do what they ask at the gate, before they even let you in, they want nothing to do with you. So it's something that you can affect as a player. I think we're going to get to in just a second. Oh, but first we've got to talk about this. Yes. So, when you are writing NPCs, it is very tempting to have them wake up at a certain time and go to work at a certain time and go to the market at a certain time and go to the inn for dinner and then go home and usually read and go to bed. And that's a very simple schedule. But if you have 9 NPCs and all of them do exactly the same schedule, suddenly you have everyone in town in the inn, and it is ridiculous. One, it's not great for the actual game itself to have huge amounts of NPCs places. In a village, you'd probably not break your game, but if you did it in a city, it wouldn't be great. But it's also highly unimmersive why everyone would suddenly be in one place. It's weird. So in order to avoid that sort of clumping and gridlock of everyone having to get out at the same time. I'm sure we've all been behind some NPCs as they had to leave an inn, and there were like 3 NPCs trying to leave the inn and you couldn't get around them, so you had to wait. Very, very unimmersive experience and annoying to encounter. In order to avoid that, you use spreadsheets. So if your lead does not provide something like this, which I would really doubt that they would, please do it. Like, you will get used to it quickly. Then you will be in such a good position to never have 2 people doing exactly the same thing at the same time. It's not hard to set up. Just use Google Sheets, put the names of your characters and the times, and you'll be golden. And then you'll realize that everybody's doing something at the same time, or nobody is available. Because jumping back 1, encountering NPCs is also extremely important. It's really tempting to have someone who's maybe a weaver wake up, have breakfast in their home, weave in their home for most of the day, maybe go outside for a walk for an hour and then come back inside. But that only gives the player an hour to see that NPC. Because most players don't just walk randomly into NPCs' houses, because most players don't even think to. 1, it's discouraged, so if you're a law-abiding player, you're not likely to do that. But 2, you're thinking about what you see. If you see an NPC who you haven't seen before, you go, "Who's that?" And then you talk to them. But if you're just walking around, you don't think, maybe there are new interesting NPCs in these closed buildings. Out of sight, out of mind really works for players. So you have to make sure that they're actually places where you can encounter them. They don't always have to be outside or at work, but people may take more walks than a normal person would do, or may spend more time eating lunch. 3 hours to eat a piece of bread, no, you don't really need that. But if that's one of the only times that you can see this NPC and talk to them, then yeah, lunch can go on for 3 hours. Whatever. Because unless the player's a very obsessive person, they're not going to stand there for the 3 hours and watch. It's just when you're going to encounter those NPCs. So make sure your NPCs are encounterable. Spreadsheet, again, cannot recommend enough. And then last thing that I think I'm going to say on this one is change can happen. Change can happen, and it can be player-driven or quest-driven. Sometimes what I mean by that is the player can have a conversation with an NPC and insult them, and then the NPC's attitude towards the player will change. That can also affect other people in that NPC's life. If you insult the matriarch of a clan, maybe everyone in the clan suddenly treats you a little bit different. But those are driven by player choices, specifically in an NPC dialogue situation, not necessarily a quest. Quest-driven ones are usually even more major, often affect the fate of the town or the fate of someone within the town, and can be as drastic as people dying, and then you have to, as a writer, redo the schedules, redo how the town works. Or can be something like the town now has a new industry. Well, you also have to figure out how the town is going to work now that there's a major quest-driven change. Both of them can happen. It doesn't always have to be a quest that changes people's attitudes towards you and their dialogue. And then random events are just like, if a dragon attacks or something like that, or vampires, people can occasionally die. Make sure that your sequences of events between NPCs can exist with one person missing. So if I know we don't really have this, but if the maid brings the milk to the cheese person who uses the milk to make cheese, who brings it to the market person, and the market person sells it, make sure you can do that without the milkmaid, or do that without the cheese person, because dragons happen. So now we're going to move on to the actual build a village portion of this. Spend about 15 minutes on this, maybe. We'll see. Let's see how long we can keep this up. But this is going to be the spreadsheet that you saw earlier with the genders and the races and the names and the little descriptions. We're going to put it back up. And what I would recommend you do is grab a pen and paper or a Google Doc and start creating your own conceptualization of who those characters are. If a lead just handed you that spreadsheet and said, these are our characters for here, see what you can do with it, what would you do with it? And figure you have one get out of jail free card if you want to change your race or a gender or a backstory. Figure you can mess with one of them. Because if you go back to your lead and you have done nothing that they provided you, they may be a little confused. But yeah, figure you can change one of them. And then just on your own, sketch out some stuff if you feel like it. Knit and I are also going to be talking through how we would talk through characters. And you can mute us if you'd rather just pay attention on your own and come back in for the Q&A at the end. Or listen to the way that we work with these. This is not an assignment. You should in no way submit this to the writing channel or anything. This is just for you to know how you would do it. So here is our spreadsheet. We've got
Bosmerville.
Yes, forgot. So, where to start? Knit?
Well, let's start with the bridge keeper. Why is there an Altmer? Was it this person sent there? Is he a Thalmor representative? Is he somehow keeping an eye on the townspeople? What is with his staff?
Yeah, it says he dresses in robes, which is not specifically Thalmor robes. We could request Thalmor robes if we needed to request Thalmor robes, but it would be kind of odd for a solo Thalmor representative to be just hanging on a bridge. I would want there to probably be a very distinct reason that he would be interested in this little town. If there's something that the Dominion is interested in as a whole within this town, that could be the secret of this town. That could be what the town quest centers on. So it's something we could think about doing. But I think it's an interesting to take if you just wanted to treat him as like a older Altmarie wizard who's there, perhaps keeping the two sides apart, perhaps keeping the peace between the two sides.
Yeah, so what has happened to make them need a bridge keeper? Or is he maybe just keeping the trade route open and watching out for bandits or something like that? I don't know. The innkeeper is intriguing. What happened to her husband? Is he dead in the basement? Is she even married? Did she have a husband, or did she just arrive in this town and say she had a husband? There's a quest possibly there as well, finding out what happened to her.
I was just going to say that's something that I would start writing up a proposal on to see whether we were interested in pursuing it. But I think it would be interesting to find her husband, but she doesn't seem interested in giving that quest herself. So maybe somebody who knew her, like Durranian, the hunter, is middle-aged, so is Thalwyn, the innkeeper. If they're both from this town, they may have grown up together, and Durranian may know something about that whole husband thing.
Well, and it's possible that you could have Thalwyn and Durranian have been rivals for the affections of this person as well. So there might be animosity between the hunter and the innkeeper that you could work with as well.
Durranian could also have done something to the husband if she was jealous or wanted to get back at him for jilting her or wanted him for herself. Because we've got her husband right now who is a young adult and is nervous and jumpy. and we have to figure out why he's nervous and jumpy. And if he thinks that perhaps his wife is a murderer, that would be
That would be
interesting.
great.
Yeah. Of course, we could also have it, which would be, I think, a little more interesting, is if we followed the overdramatic, she definitely killed him out of jealousy thing, and then he's just living in the woods because he likes to be alone, or something like that, where it's a sudden letdown with the quest. So we could incorporate it where, or maybe he didn't even know he was supposed to be missing. I read a story about that in real life, that someone joined in on their own search party because they didn't realize that they were the one being searched. They didn't realize everyone was searching for them. So there could be some aspect of that where he's just doing his own thing, and there are all these rumors spreading about, Durranian killed him, or Thalwyn is mourning and will never speak his name again because he betrayed her, or whatever it is, and we can have him be just sort of chilling.
That would work.
So that would be a possible step there.
What's with the Khajiit servant?
Yeah, I was just going to say.
How did he get there?
Yeah, and that's the thing. It says he speaks like he's from elsewhere. I don't think he's from elsewhere.
You think he just speaks like that?
I'd love it if he was from, like, Bravo or something. Or something even farther away, where his family has been merchants or whatever, but in a city for ages, and he doesn't actually speak with the Khajiit accent, but he does it either because he thinks it's cool or because he's hiding from something. I think it would be interesting to have that. He definitely has to keep the accent, though.
And what does he know about the innkeeper? If he's the servant, he might also be involved in knowledge about the husband, or any suspicious activity. He could be a source of information for the player for that.
He could be. If we wanted to expand that to a full side quest that had multiple objectives, we could have multiple people to interview. But yeah, he could know things about that. We have another Khajiit that is
an adopted child, which is very strange because that's not usual. Let's talk about her.
Yeah, to be adopted by a Bosmer is very unusual.
And she's originally named Rasmina. Who renamed her, and how does she feel about that? If she was, it's true. Does she know? But if she was adopted at an age where she knew her family before and they were killed or something, and the Bosmer who has adopted her has just renamed her because he wants to, she might be resentful. She might not be happy in this situation. And she also might have some relationship to the Khajiit servant in some way. Maybe he's arrived because of this child who's been taken from his clan, and he's there to protect her.
She has magical abilities, so that would be plausible as a quest between those two, because if she has magical abilities, perhaps she is valuable to a particular caravan or a particular clan or tribal group in a way that just a child who went missing might not be. So
that's true. Yeah,
be sneaking in and be new to being the innkeeper's servant, only been there a month or two, and he's looking for a way to kidnap the Khajiit child and take her away.
And the player can either assist or thwart the kidnapping. Those would be an interesting branching option for a quest. And that would also affect how everyone in the village reacts to the player when they come back.
Absolutely. And if we went with that route, then I changed my mind. He should actually be from elsewhere, because that's where he should be taking her. One, because it makes more sense to sort of be reuniting her with her people. But two, then we don't need to see them again if he succeeds.
That's true.
Yes. Which is
if he succeeds, they're gone. Yeah, that's true.
Of course, with two missing people, we would have to possibly add someone conditionally who would take the place of the servant and be the new servant. That wouldn't be too hard. We could ask the lead about that.
No, you don't have to have a servant. I mean, that's sort of an optional position.
It is. Obviously, Enthamor, the adoptive father, would have a lot of changed dialogue after that quest.
Mhm.
But wouldn't need necessarily, as the fishery owner, to change his schedule. So his schedule would be the same.
Mhm.
But it would be nice to have an innkeeper servant. So I think it's worth asking if we do that quest, whether we can get a secondary.
Another NPC to come in after the quest.
We might even relegate Azabask to the status of quest NPC so that they would appear when the player enters the village, but be essentially part of the quest. And then they would be replaced by Servant 2, who would be the permanent servant for the rest of the game. So that would be doable, because most of Azabask's dialogue could be considered quest related. I don't know. It would depend what we were doing with Valenwood and the others.
Why do you think the Weaver is nervous and jumpy? Does he have a secret that he doesn't want?
I'm saying that he might think that Durranian killed her husband.
Right, but if it wasn't about Durranian, maybe he has his own reasons for being nervous and jumpy. Maybe, and he came from outside of town. Is he being hunted? Is he using an alias? Is he going to be found out by somebody who's looking for him? And because he's a weaver, he's pretty identifiable by his trade.
Maybe, but it would also kind of be funny if we just had him be nervous and jumpy for the sake of being nervous and jumpy.
Just because he is.
Because we have so much else going on between people who are disguising themselves, people who are searching for hidden people. We have a lot of disguise mapped out.
And secrets,
And secrets. And it'd be funny if he really didn't have any. He was just sort of the person where you came in and said hello and he went, huh.
Yes.
I think that would be really entertaining. I'm not sure we could get the animations for that to be fully effective. But,
that would be very good.
We've got 2
Let's
minutes.
talk about the sisters.
Yes.
Yes, the sisters. Well, why do they live in one room? What's going on with that? Are they
I think ghosts.
Afraid of? You think ghosts? Yeah.
Oh yeah, gotta be ghosts, right? Or something like that, or a curse. Or there was this lady once in the early 1900s, I think, who was told by a medium that she would be cursed to die unless she continued to build her house.
Oh, right, that house. She had to build a room every year.
She had to be continually under construction, and then she would live. And she lived another 40 years, so the house is a monstrosity. And it still exists, and it's like a tourist destination somewhere in Oklahoma or something. But if it was the opposite of that, like they're cursed to live in a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller space.
They have to keep retreating.
Yeah, that would maybe be fun.
So if they have a multi-room house, the family used to be affluent then, and these are elderly women whose family has declined in some way. If they're the only ones left in this large house, it would make sense that they had status before, and they're probably still trying to hold on to it since she's haughty, Orwinda. But Feodora is a blabbermouth. She likes to talk. I don't think she's senile, though. No. I don't think she's senile. I don't think she's talking to, nobody. I think she just is going to spill the beans, and I think Orwinda is worried about that.
Mm-hmm. We need to wrap up now so that we can have 5 minutes of Q&A. It's very fun to make a town, as you can see. And
we're just getting started.
Oh yeah, we can do this for a long
time. For an hour.
But if you have questions, now is the time. If you have your own ideas about how the town should go and everything, just keep those to yourself so you can keep working on them if you choose to do so, or have a discussion in the student lounge and area about that if you feel like it. It's always nice to bounce ideas off people, as you can see. Any questions?
How many times do you have to check out with the implementing team for something that may or may not be possible in terms of scripting or world building, things like that?
When you are doing NPCs, I leave a note. I go, if this is possible, as a comment. And then sometimes I leave an alternate, like, if this is not possible, this is probably what you should do. Sometimes I don't, and I just figure when we get to that bridge, we will cross it. Because we don't know as writers a lot of the time the animations people are working on or what animations would be feasible to ask. Like, can we ask for a silk weaving animation? Well, it's a lot of work, sure, but if a lot of people in that area are weavers, it'd be worth the time. So that's the sort of thing where you can just leave a note on the document that says, I know we probably don't have this, but if we do, that'd be great.
Or you could suggest an animation, this is a person, opening a chest, for example. This would be where that would be. It's a usable animation for a different purpose. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, more or less, thanks.
Next person, I heard someone coming in.
Yeah, that was me. I have a question. So when you're working on a village, I asked this at the start, but basically, like, what sources do you use, or like, where do you talk with people who are more knowledgeable in Elder Scrolls lore? Do you mic it up and like try and fit it to lore later on? Like, how, let's say for the names or for the actual region of the city, how do you get, let's say, oh, this place is really rich in materials, so we should have a mining town. How should you figure stuff out like that?
I mean, yes.
Well, that's sometimes something you don't figure out because your lead gives that to you. Your lead says, well, we need you to write the NPCs and the characters for this town that is in the woods and has a river nearby, and they place it for you in the province that you're working on if you're on a project very often.
Asking, though, there's no harm in doing that. Like, if a writer reaches out to me and says, hey, I'm supposed to be exporting this when it's not legal, we can go, oh, we didn't mean that, or, oh, in lore it says that we could do it this way. Your leads are not infallible. They certainly do make a lot of mistakes sometimes, but between the whole of your team, there's likely someone who knows the lore very, very well, and you can reach out to your peers as well for a bit of advice. And when you are on the drive and Trellos of a project, there is a lore section specifically for your province, and that has tons of lore in it, so check there first, and there might be something already.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks.
Anyone else?
We have 1 minute. We have no minutes.
I do have a question, just a big thank you for this. This was very interesting and helpful.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah, thanks guys. That was awesome.
It was very fun to speculate on lecture hall chat about the neural nature.
You can see why having two people to talk it over is really helpful, because you could just interrupt each other and bounce things off each other, and it's really a rich way of coming up with ideas.